Hey guys, tonight we will delve into a less-told turning point in history in the autumn of 1537, when the sound of cannons echoed throughout Hampton Court Palace to celebrate the arrival of the first male heir after 28 years of upheaval. A queen in the royal chambers was enduring relentless hemorrhaging. Jane Seymour, the quiet woman who gave her life to bring Henry VIII, the son he had longed for, was ultimately abandoned in the darkness of power. We have compiled this story from a variety of sources, from court chronicles to diplomatic correspondence and modern medical analysis, so you can discern for yourself what is fact and what is mere rumor. If you find any detail plausible or questionable, leave a comment below so our community of history lovers can discuss together. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Where are you watching from? And what time is it there? Share your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the autumn of 1537, as the cannons of Hampton Court Fortress still rolled across the skies of London, courtiers and commoners alike cheered in jubilation at the long-awaited news of a legitimate son for the Tudor throne. But within the closed-door royal chambers, Jane Seymour was enduring her final life-or-death moments. Her labour, relentless and unending, stretched over 2 full days and 2 long nights, pressing all the world's pain into her fragile body. With every laboured breath and each bead of sweat slipping down her brow, Jane sensed that her life had grown as thin and tenuous as a single thread. From the very first minutes, the confinement chamber had been lavishly adorned, deep red velvet drapes falling softly, thick silk carpets covering the floor, and scented candles filling the air with gentle fragrance. Court physicians and a retinue of ladies in waiting, dressed in formal attire, kneeled around her bed, murmuring prayers to all the corners of heaven, while their hands busied themselves, mixing herbal poultices and gently wiping her brow. Yet all this pomp and ceremony served only as a curtain to conceal the paralysis of Renaissance medicine. The so-called pain relief amounted to nothing more than handfuls of dried herbs wrapped in cloth. Their cuts and bandages often widened her wounds, and every miracle cure hinged on folk remedies untested by any scientific standard. On the first day, as the pain surged with brutal intensity, Jane gripped the bedposts and muttered prayers under her breath, asking for no mercy. A lady-in-waiting quietly scraped her skin with a cool stone, sprinkled herbal powders on her forehead, and then fanned her with a feather fan that offered only the faintest whisper of relief. In the hushed chamber, the only sounds were her low moans and the soft rustle of the fan. Each contraction felt as if her very bones were being crushed, and Jane could feel every cell in her body tightening in agony. By the first night, hope had nearly faded when the physicians discovered signs of retained placenta. Their hushed voices trembled as they warned, without intervention, both mother and child are in grave danger. Those words struck Jane's heart like a whip. They resolved to perform an early form of caesarean, an almost certainly fatal procedure in that era, solely to save the prince. The surgeon's blade sliced into her flesh, and she screamed in anguish. Yet there was no anaesthetic to soften the terror. On the second day, amid triumphant cheers, Prince Edward was born. In that moment, the entire court seemed to forget the queen who bled to death in the chamber next door. The palace resonated with joy. Cannons boomed, church bells pealed, and bonfires lit the night sky. Yet for Jane there was only darkness and blood. She held her breath as she looked at her son's tiny, flushed face in the physician's hands, then felt the weakness coursing through her veins, and wept silently. After the newborn was taken to special care, Jane remained where she lay, blood soaking into the sheets. The physicians recorded each detail: severe blood loss, critical condition. But instead of seeking any effective method to staunch the bleeding, they bent every effort to protect the child. They feared that the newborn's precious life would be endangered by his mother's cries. and distressing sight. Thus, they ordered Jane to be kept isolated from the prince's chamber, a decision that cut her to the core. She begged, "Let me see my child," only to be met with a cold shake of the head that is not safe. For the next 12 days, the court calculated her life in a cold ledger. The prince's survival could secure the dynasty. While a mother could be replaced, Jane saw the silhouettes of the ladies in waiting gliding past her door, bringing herbal broths for her to drink. Yet no healing elixirs, nor useful medical interventions arrived. She moaned softly in delirium. Her heart pounded fiercely from blood loss, and her face grew pale. Nevertheless, history draped Jane Seymour's death in a pure white shroud. Official records declared that she passed away peacefully of childbirth complications. Court-appointed historians lauded her as a heroine who willingly sacrificed her life for the realm. Poems praised her as a pure white jasmine, and portraits depicted her in flowing white robes, her gaze serene, as if she had simply slipped into a gentle sleep. But the truth was far darker. Scattered medical logs and diplomatic letters from the Spanish and French ambassadors at court mentioned a miraculous survival attempt and death from relentless hemorrhaging. Some attendants in the royal chambers later recounted how they wept in shock at the sight of blood spreading across the bedclothes. Rumour even had it that King Henry casually declared, "Wives are easy to find. A son is above all else." Jane Seymour's death laid bare the most brutal corners of the Tudor court. Maternal love and marital bonds utterly destroyed and reduced to tools of dynastic ambition. She, once hailed as the mother of the realm, was ultimately cast into oblivion and met with absolute indifference. In her final royal chamber, the velvet drapes lay heavy with dust, and the candlelight flickered weakly. Jane's body, draped in white linen, bore a face peaceful, as though in slumber. Yet her cold hand clutched a blood-stained handkerchief. The ladies in waiting knelt before her bed, weeping in silence, while the court busied itself preparing the prince's baptism, with no sign of King Henry by her side. On the 24th day of October, in the year 1537, Jane departed this world. She had ruled as queen for less than 11 months, and never saw her son grow beyond infancy. Instead of grand funeral fanfare, her passing was marked only by whispered prayers of attendants, the echo of wind through empty corridors, and the distant tolling of church bells remind us that power and life rarely walk hand in hand. Jane Seymour played a pivotal role in the Tudor dynasty's turning point. Yet, she was not a hero in the annals of history. She was a victim of a merciless system in which a woman's life counted for little more than a pawn on the political chessboard, and when power reached its zenith, anyone, even a queen, could be erased from the map of humanity. Her death opened a tragic chapter in history, but also served as a stark warning to future generations. No glory shines so brightly as to conceal injustice. No title so noble as to outrank the right to live. And no romantic palace tale remains beautiful when built upon cruelty. In her final moments of fading consciousness, Jane may have yearned only to hear her child's cry, to behold that tender face once more. Yet she was denied even a single moment of such solace. And so, Hampton Court fell silent again. The fortress no longer thundered with triumphant salvos. The palace windows stood shuttered. Only candle stubs and blood-stained sheets bore witness. Jane Seymour's memory is etched forever into the cold stone walls, reminding us that behind every glory lies the tragedy of those unseen souls who gave all and were forgotten. Jane Seymour was not the great love of Henry VIII, but rather a strategic choice of the court and the Seymour family. Barely 11 days after Anne Boleyn's execution on the 19th of May in 1536, Jane was measured for her wedding gown and crowned queen. This breathtaking speed spoke volumes of her own, and her family's ambition to seize the empty seat of marriage and climb to the pinnacle of power. Unlike the fiery Anne Boleyn or the gentle Catherine of Aragon, Jane had been educated to embody the ideal of submissive femininity. Known in court as obedient and devoted, she wore her meekness as armour, concealing a clear-eyed awareness that her survival depended entirely on her ability to produce a male heir. Behind every curtsy and every whispered "Your Majesty" lay the unspoken truth. Fail to bear a son, and her fate would mirror that of her predecessors. Each passing month without the announcement of a pregnancy intensified the precariousness of her position. In the grand halls of the palace, courtiers traded nervous glances, whispering rumours and speculations. Jane's family, ever vigilant, marshalled every resource to secure her success. They provided her with sumptuous meals designed to nourish fertility, monitored her menstrual cycles with meticulous care, and ensured she followed diets deemed most propitious for conception. Meanwhile, Jane herself was confined within the palace walls, forbidden from the simple pleasures of strolling gardens or attending festivals. Her world shrank to the dimensions of her chamber, where she spent long, drowsy hours awaiting that fateful day when her body might bear the future of the Tudor line. This isolation, imposed by both duty and necessity, rendered her body a vessel dedicated solely to dynastic continuity. Every aspect of her life, what she ate, how she moved, even how she slept, was dictated by the demands of succession. The gentle rustle of silk curtains and the soft glow of candlelight became her constant companions. Outside her door, the palace buzzed with intrigue and aspiration. Inside, Jane lay in a kind of suspended animation, her mind drifting between hope and fear. The quietude of her confinement was punctuated only by the subdued footsteps of her ladies-in-waiting and the hushed voices of physicians. They arrived at dawn, bearing delicate bowls of herbal infusions. At dusk, they returned with palliatives promising to soothe her body and mind. Yet these remedies, drawn from the limited medical understanding of the age, offered no true comfort. Jane's thoughts often wandered. As she lay on her canopied bed, she pictured the future son she had yet to conceive, wondered whether he would smile like his father or laugh like her own kin, and braced herself for the moment when that yearning might finally be fulfilled. Within the ornate confines of the palace, her transformation from gentle lady to potential life-bearer was complete. The walls that once echoed with laughter now witnessed her quiet vigil. Precious jewels and brocade robes offered little solace as she pondered the weight of her destiny. Jane understood that she was both queen and instrument, cherished and yet entirely expendable should she fail in her duty. As the months slipped by in a haze of perfumed air and whispered counsel, Jane's demeanour remained silent. To the outside world, she seemed the epitome of grace under pressure, never allowing fear or impatience to mar her composure. Her courtesy ribbons and the soft lilt of her voice concealed the ceaseless calculations of her mind. Each sunrise marked another tally in the ledger of her fate. Each moonlit night brought her closer to either triumph or oblivion. Thus, Jane Seymour's earliest days as queen unfolded not in grand ceremonies or jubilant processions, but in the dimly lit seclusion of her chambers, where her very being was devoted to securing the Tudor legacy. In that quiet, sleepy atmosphere, so unlike the clamorous courts of her predecessors, she waited, ever hopeful, yet ever aware that her body was the fulcrum upon which the future of England teetered. As soon as word spread that Jane was with child in early 1537, the entire royal household turned its attention to the gentle curve of her belly. Her ladies-in-waiting, clad in soft silks, they kept meticulous records of every sign: bouts of nausea at dawn, subtle shifts in appetite, the gradual swell of her figure. Court physicians arrived at her chamber each morning, and dusk, not out of tender concern for Jane's well-being, but to ensure the precious air within was thriving. Her meals, once chosen to delight her senses, were now carefully prescribed nourishing broths, fortified breads, tinctures of rare herbs measured to the precise grain. The walls of her confinement room, draped in pale tapestries, offered only the barest comforts needed to safeguard the life growing within her. This physical and emotional isolation sapped Jane's strength day by weary day. The gentle hush of whispered names floated through corridors, but laughter and song were forbidden in her halls. The small, drowsy room smelled faintly of damp earth and crushed lavender, and each footstep echoed hollowly on the stone floors. Every laborious breath she drew was recorded in the physician's journals. Each gentle shift of her weight, noted by the watchful hand of a handmaiden. As twilight fell, Jane could hear the muted murmur of distant voices, plotting elaborate celebrations for the prince's arrival, while she remained a silent sentinel to her own fate. The strain weighed heavily upon her spirit. She lay on her cushioned bed, propped by velvet pillows, the candlelight dancing like sleepy embers across the walls. Her mind drifted in and out of fevered dreams. She saw herself gliding through grand banquets, cradling her newborn son beneath a canopy of silver. Then she awoke with a start, her heart thudding in her chest, reminding her that reality offered no guarantee of safety. If she failed to bear a son, she knew the shadows waiting in the palace would consume her next, as they had consumed queen before queen. Meanwhile, outside the hush of Jane's chambers, the court buzzed with excitement. Silk banners were hung from balconies, and trumpets rehearsed their fanfares. Courtiers in gleaming armour and silken brocade whispered of processions and triumphs, their voices rising in eager anticipation of the royal baptism. Ambassadorial envoys jostled for place at the palace gates, each eager to secure influence with the expected heir. Foreign dignitaries polished their speeches, preparing to ply gifts of jewels and silken cloth in hopes of curry favour. The palace gardens, where Jane once strolled beneath blossoming boughs, now teemed with gardeners, trimming roses into statuesque forms, as if sculpting beauty to match the future prince's birth. In those hallowed halls, political intrigue wove its intricate patterns. Factions formed over subtly shifted alliances. Would the Queen's family hold the reins of power if she delivered a son, or would a rival house seek to supplant them? Should the child prove weak? Every whispered speculation, every furtive glance carried weighty significance. Yet Jane, once the centre of courtly grace, it had become little more than a vessel for their schemes, a living incubator, whose very heartbeat was the measure of dynastic hope. Within the confines of her solitude, Jane grappled with a tide of loneliness. Her closest attendant, a gentle woman named Margaret, would sit by her side and braid her hair into a single plait, humming lullabies in a soft voice meant to soothe both mind and body. Margaret's presence offered fleeting warmth, but she too lived in fear, knowing that her mistress's survival meant favour at court, while her demise would invite suspicion and blame upon her head. Each nightfall brought the same routine: a bowl of warm milk scented with honey, a careful adjustment of linens, and the final whispered benediction from the royal chaplain, beseeching divine protection for mother and unborn child. By day's end, Jane's world had narrowed to the gentle rise and fall of her own chest. The hush in her chamber weighed like velvet curtains drawn across her spirit. She longed for the simplest freedom to walk beneath the sun, to feel the wind dance through her skirts, but those liberties were now luxuries too dear for the court to afford. Her body, once her own, belonged wholly to the crown. Her every movement was a testament to the tenuous line between life and legacy. In the gentle dusk that settled outside her windows, Jane closed her eyes and listened to the muted fanfare drifting from the distant throne room. The promise of new life shimmered on the breeze. Yet it carried with it a solemn reminder. She was no longer simply a queen, but a guardian of the Tudor future. And in that drowsy intersection of hope and fear, Jane lay wrapped in silken confinement, awaiting the day when the world would finally know whether her sacrifice would bring triumph or sorrow to the court she could no longer truly call home. On the 9th of October 1537, Jane officially went into labour. The contractions began with a gentle pang, only to swell into relentless waves of agony that carried her through 2 full days and 2 nights. In the dim candlelight of her confinement chamber, she writhed upon the silken sheets, each breath a labour unto itself. With Renaissance medicine at its most rudimentary, Physicians resorted to the crude interventions of the age, raking a knife across the pelvic bone, pressing upon her swollen abdomen, and even attempting a primitive caesarean in their haste to save the unborn prince. Jane bore each procedure with a quiet fortitude, her body slick with sweat and blood, deprived of any true anesthetic or relief. When the cries of a newborn at last pierced the hush of the palace on that second night, the court erupted in triumph. Cannons thundered across the battlements of Hampton Court. Church bells tolled in every parish, and bonfires lit the sky in celebration of the long-awaited male heir. Yet in the chamber beside the one bursting with gaiety, Jane remained tethered to her blood-soaked bed. Her postpartum hemorrhage, likely the result of retained placenta, or perhaps an undetected uterine tear, refused to cease. Each hour, her strength ebbed further away, her cheeks hollowed, and her eyes heavy with fevered exhaustion. For the next 12 days, Jane was treated more like an accessory to the proceedings than a living, breathing queen. Physicians arrived at dawn, leaning over her fragile frame to note the volume of blood lost, then departed without applying any truly effective remedy. Herbal poultices and bleeding leeches were applied in rote fashion, but the bleeding persisted, as if her very life force was being siphoned away one slow drip at a time. The soft rustling of parchment filled her ears as court scribes recorded each dire pronouncement, their quills scratching out words like critical condition and urgent care, while Jane's own pulse fluttered unnoticed beneath their official records. Outside her door, the palace rejoiced for the child, now christened Edward. Taffeta banners fluttered in the corridors. Courtiers in gilt-trimmed doublets exchanged silver, gilded toasts. Foreign ambassadors jostled to deliver gifts of cloth of gold and rare spices. Yet Jane's pleas for a moment with her son, that she might cradle the infant who had cost her so dearly, were met with a firm refusal. They feared that the sight of his mother's weakening form might distress the newborn prince. "It is too risky," they said, and so she lay alone, listening to the distant laughter and the soft coos of her child, her heart torn between relief at his survival and despair at her own suffering. As the days dripped by, Jane's vitality waned. Each dawn found her weaker still. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and her once fervent spirit grew stiller with every passing hour. Her ladies-in-waiting knelt by her side with tear-bright eyes, offering sips of cool water and murmured prayers. But their ministrations could not staunch the crimson tide. Physicians, bound by protocol, and perhaps by fear of displeasing the king, continued their perfunctory attendance, measuring her blood loss, yet withholding any bold course of action that might have spared her life. On the 24th of October, 1537, Jane Seymour, no more than 29 years old, and having reigned for less than 18 months, passed from this world in solitude and agony. There were no ceremonial volleys of cannon to mark her final departure, no grand procession of mourners trailing through the palace gates. Instead, a handful of servants arranged her body upon a bier draped in white. Their footsteps hushed against the stone floors. The chapel where her funeral rites were held was lit by a few flickering candles, and only the quiet intonation of prayer broke the silence. By the time the echoes of her funeral subsided, King Henry had already turned his gaze toward future alliances. Courtiers whispered of potential brides, daughters of foreign princes, whose marriages might secure new treaties or bolster ties with powerful realms. Within mere days of Jane's burial, portraits of noble women arrived at court, each one scrutinized for beauty, fertility, and political advantage. And so the chapter of Jane Seymour's life drew to a close, her sacrifice overshadowed by the thrill of dynastic continuity. While her son would grow to become a prince cherished by the realm, his mother remained a ghost within the palace walls, remembered in verse as the gentle queen who gave her life for Tudor's future, yet largely absent from the lavish tapestries and marble effigies that commemorated other royal consorts. In the hushed corners of story and song, Jane's memory fluttered like a candle flame in the wind, flickering between reverence and regret. forever entwined with the harsh realities of power and the fragile worth of a woman's life. Immediately after the moment Prince Edward was born, the entire kingdom seemed to drown in triumph. Cannons boomed across the battlements, church bells tolled in every parish, and bonfires blossomed like fiery roses under the night sky. Yet while courtiers revelled in their victory, in the adjoining chamber, Jane Seymour lay trapped in her confinement bed, blood still streaming from her body. The royal physicians, rather than focusing their efforts on stemming her flow, continued to prioritize the health of the newborn prince. Their postpartum examinations consisted chiefly of measuring her blood loss, with no truly effective medical intervention offered to save the Queen's life. For 12 long days, Jane endured torments that drained her strength hour by hour. Each dawn saw her body weakened further. Each sunset found her spirits sinking deeper into exhaustion. Whenever she pleaded for just a few moments with her son, the attending surgeons and court physicians offered gentle refusals, citing fears that seeing his mother in such dire straits might unsettle the infant's fragile heart. And so she remained, queen yet utterly alone. No family member was permitted to comfort her. No friend allowed to whisper solace. The contrast between the joyous festivities beyond her door and her own lonely agony painted a stark portrait of courtly indifference and, perhaps, of Henry VIII's own chilling detachment. When news of Jane's critical condition finally reached the king, he offered little in the way of personal concern. Instead, accounts suggest that he busied himself with preparations for Prince Edward's baptism, dispatching letters to invite noble sponsors and ensuring the finest silver baptismal font gleamed in Westminster Abbey. Simultaneously, he turned his attention to matrimonial politics, entertaining proposals from foreign courts for a new queen to secure alliances and shore up Tudor interests. The king's sole priority in those hours appeared to be the unbroken continuation of his dynasty, regardless of the mortal cost borne by his third wife. At last, on the 24th of October, 1537, Jane Seymour, only 29 years old, and having reigned for less than 18 months, breathed her last in that same pale chamber where her labour had begun. The announcement of her passing came softly. There were no cannon salvos to mark her death, no trumpets to honour her memory. Her body was conveyed with quiet dignity to Westminster Abbey. Yet even her funeral rites were kept modest, so as not to eclipse the joyous solemnity of her son's recent baptism. A few flickering candles illuminated the simple wooden coffin, and a handful of mourners offered subdued prayers for her soul. Jane Seymour's departure left behind a sombre lesson on the value of human life within the Tudor court. Here was a woman once exalted as the mother of the realm, who had fulfilled her duty by giving birth to the long-sought heir, only to be discarded without regret or ceremony once that task was complete. Her end stands as a painful reminder that, in an age of dynastic ambition, even a queen's worth could be measured solely by her utility, and that, once that measure was satisfied, her life might be deemed expendable. In the hushed hush of history's pages, Jane's story lingers as a testament to the harsh calculus of power and the fragile humanity it so often neglects. Immediately following the funeral rites, the Tudor court set into motion a carefully orchestrated campaign to recast Jane Seymour as the very embodiment of noble sacrifice. In the hushed halls of Westminster and the shadowed galleries of Whitehall, court poets composed verse after gentle verse, likening her to a saint whose final breath had secured the realm's future. Golden statues sprang up in marble niches, each sculpted with serene countenance, her hands folded in devotional grace. Court painters, summoned by royal decree, set brush to canvas to capture her likeness with soft, reverent strokes here, gaze cast downward, her features composed in tranquil resignation, obscuring every trace of the mortal anguish she had endured. At the same time, royal historians were tasked with weaving her death into the official chronicle as a heroic offering made to secure the prince's destiny. Their florid prose depicted Jane as a willing martyr, joyously surrendering her life for the sovereign power, while omitting any mention of the blood-strewn sheets or the dozen days of torment that had marked her final hours. The narrative unfolded as a kind of sacred drama, each line designed to reinforce Henry VIII's reputation as a loving husband and devoted father. Rather than the cold pragmatist who had watched his wife fade, all medical horrors were left unspoken, replaced by lofty metaphors of purity and devotion, converting Jane's real suffering into an almost mythical spectacle of regal piety. To shore up this image, the Crown issued a proclamation restricting any foreign dispatches that might hint at the darker truths of Jane's passing. Even the ambassadors from France and Spain, though they no doubt carried rumours of her grievous injuries and prolonged agony, were instructed to maintain silence, lest they undermine the dignity of the Tudor name. Thus, for centuries, the story of Jane Seymour's peaceful passing after childbirth complications endured unchallenged in schoolbooks and popular histories. Only in modern times, when scholars pored over diplomatic letters and extant medical journals, did the fuller, grimmer account finally emerge from the archives. This deft propaganda effort served Henry VIII's interests remarkably well. To the populace and to the nobility alike, he appeared as the grieving monarch, heartbroken by the loss of his beloved queen. Yet behind that carefully crafted facade lay the truth: his third wife had become a casualty of political expediency and medical neglect. By transforming Jane into a symbol of devotion, the king managed to appear compassionate, even as he prepared to seek a fourth marriage that would again serve the shifting alliances and dynastic urgencies of his era. In the soft glow of torchlight and the whispered hush of cathedral chapels, Jane Seymour's memory was sanctified. Lullabies were penned in her honour, songs meant to lull restless infants to sleep by recounting her gentle sacrifice. Generations of mothers tucked these verses into cradles, unaware of the pain that inspired them. Through hushed repetition in hushed corridors, the myth of a serene queen who quietly gave her life for her child took root in the national consciousness. Yet beneath the guilt and the glowing tributes, the cold reality remained. Jane had been used by those around her, her humanity sacrificed upon the altar of Tudor ambition. The same court that celebrated her as a perfect consort had, in truth, treated her as little more than a means to an end. In the end, the very campaign meant to immortalize her devotion only underscored the tragedy of her fate, a gentle soul ensnared in a web of power. Her final act, co-opted into a legend that scarcely resembled the woman who had given all she had to the crown. And so, as the years faded and new queens took her place, Jane Seymour's image was perpetuated in art and poetry, her suffering concealed beneath layers of reverent homage. The Tudor court, ever mindful of its own legacy, had succeeded in fashioning her into a paragon of sacrifice. Yet in the quiet corners of history, the faint echo of her actual voice, the voice that must have trembled with pain and longing, lingers still, a somnolent reminder that the cost of power is often measured in the silent tears of those who give everything without ever truly being heard. Less than 6 months after Jane's quiet funeral, Henry VIII was already casting about for a new bride. In the year 1539, he married Anne of Cleves, a union arranged for political expediency rather than affection. The match with the German princess was intended to solidify alliances with Protestant states on the continent, yet it proved so ill-fitted that Henry sought its annulment almost as soon as the marriage was consummated. Next came Catherine Howard, the king's teenage cousin, whose youthful zeal briefly rekindled his passion. Their union was a vivid tableau of courtly intrigue, lavish gowns, sparkling jewels, and whispered intrigues in candlelit corridors. Yet beneath the veneer of romance lay a stark truth. Catherine Howard was a pawn in Henry's game, chosen for her beauty and her family's usefulness, rather than for any bond of genuine companionship. When whispers of her youthful indiscretions reached the king's ears, he acted swiftly and ruthlessly, revealing that passion without political benefit held no enduring place in his heart. Finally, there was Catherine Parr, a learned widow, who brought with her a modicum of stability and the comfort of shared intellectual pursuits. Catherine Parr supervised the prince's education and served as a companion and caretaker during Henry's final illness. Yet even this marriage, his sixth and last, remained tethered to political calculation. Parr's influence over the young Edward ultimately served the Regency government preparing to rule after Henry's passing. In each of these marriages, love was subordinate to alliance, and companionship was measured by advantage rather than affection. The grand ceremony held for Jane Seymour's funeral, so ceremonious in its trappings of black velvet and midnight candles, was always intended more for public spectacle than for private mourning. Statues, eulogies, and official proclamations underscored the notion of a grieving monarch and a nation united in sorrow. Yet beneath that polished exterior lay the hard truth. The Tudor court moved on without pause. For Henry, the elaborate funeral had served its purpose in shaping his image as a devoted husband. When Henry himself died in 1547, he made a final, symbolic gesture. He chose to be interred alongside Jane Seymour at Windsor Castle. This act was presented as the ultimate testament to his devotion, a vow of protection extended even beyond the grave. Yet in truth, it was but a final flourish in the king's lifelong quest to control his narrative. By resting beside his third wife, the mother of his longed-for heir, Henry ensured that posterity would remember him as a monarch who cherished his queen above all. In the turbulent years that followed, Jane's tomb in St. George's Chapel became a focal point for those seeking to bolster young Edward's claim to the throne. Visiting dignitaries offered prayers and tokens at her effigy, as if honouring her would somehow guarantee the strength of his reign. Thus, Jane's memory was enlisted once more this time to imbue her son's reign with the aura of stability and continuity that his short life demanded. Yet beneath these public gestures lay a sobering reality. Henry VIII was a man whose personal desires and national ambitions always outweighed any vestige of marital loyalty. Each bride he took was measured against the yardstick of political gain. Every marriage, a transaction in the service of dynastic power. Jane Seymour, the third in his succession of consorts, had fulfilled the ultimate role. She had borne him a son. Once that purpose was served, she was quietly set aside, her life extinguished like a candle whose flame had done its work. In the end, Jane's fate stands as a poignant testament to the cold calculus of Henry's court. She had been the perfect piece in his intricate puzzle of succession, the woman whose sacrifice would pave the way for Tudor rule. But as soon as her function was complete, she was folded into the margins of history, remembered primarily for her role as mother of the future king, rather than as the vibrant woman who had navigated the turbulent currents of the English court with grace and resolve. Thus, the tapestry of Henry's marriages reveals his unerring focus on advantage. Each union a thread woven not with the cloth of love, but with the heavy fabric of statecraft. And in that tapestry, Jane Seymour's thread, though bright and treasured in its moment, was ultimately destined to lie beneath the warp and weft of alliances and ambitions. A silent witness to the king's relentless pursuit of power, Prince Edward ascended the throne under regency. Yet his reign would span a mere 6 years before tuberculosis claimed him in 1553. With his passing, the Tudor line ebbed away, swept aside by the tumultuous successions of his half-sister Mary I and, thereafter, Elizabeth I. Though Jane Seymour had given her life so that a son might wear the crown, her sacrifice ultimately could not secure the dynasty's endurance. Her death proved only one link in the sorrowful chain of political tragedy that bound the Tudor court. Catherine of Aragon cast aside for lack of a male heir. Anne Boleyn put to death amid accusations and scandal. Catherine Howard executed for indiscretion, and Jane herself consumed by a fatal birth. Each queen, in turn, was sacrificed upon the altar of royal succession, her personal dignity subjugated to the unyielding demands of statecraft. Modern historians, poring over contemporary accounts and fragile medical notes, now speculate that with today's understanding of postpartum care and surgical technique, Jane might have survived. Yet in her own time, both the physicians and the powers that be remained unmoved by the human cost, their gaze fixed solely upon the prize of the throne. In the centuries since, Jane Seymour's legacy has been enshrined in portraits and poems, her likeness preserved in oils as the gentle mother of a king, her name invoked in elegiac verse that praises her meek virtue and noble selflessness. Meeting halls displayed sculpture busts of her serene visage. Courtly ballads repeated her story as a parable of sacrifice for crown and country. Yet buried beneath that gilded veneer lay the untold truth of her ambition, her intelligence, and the profound abandonment she endured. There was in Jane a keen mind, one attuned to the subtle rhythms of courtly politics and the intricate dance of alliance and favour. She navigated the shifting tides of Henry's desires with quiet cunning, presenting herself as the perfect balance of docility and discretion. Her ambition was not of the base sort, but rather a resolute determination to secure a future for herself and for England, to bring forth an heir who might stabilise a realm torn by schism and upheaval. Yet such qualities were conveniently overlooked once her body had served its purpose. Her memory, though polished into a myth of saintly maternity, remained obscured by centuries of hagiography. The verses that celebrated her were as soft and comforting as a lullaby, yet they omitted the fierce resolve that must have burned within her. The canvases that depicted her in pastel gowns, and with gentle smiles, concealed the reality of her suffering in bloodied linens and unrelenting pain. Jane's true narrative of a woman who grasped the levers of power with silent resolve, whose final days were marked by betrayal and solitude, lay buried beneath layers of flattering artifice. We seldom pause to wonder what Jane might have achieved had she lived perhaps a role as Queen Regent for her young son, guiding the realm with wisdom earned through her own trials. Perhaps a reunion of the courtly factions under her moderate hand, reconciling the religious strife that would soon engulf England. Instead, her promise dissolved in the hush of her confined chamber, her voice silenced just as her son's destiny began to unfold. In reflecting upon her fate, we are reminded of the fragile line that separates legend from reality. The portraits and panegyrics that survive speak to the longing for a tale of noble devotion and selfless love, qualities that give comfort and inspire reverence. Yet the unvarnished truth of Jane's life calls us to confront the colder truths of history, that power, in its most unyielding form, often demands the most painful sacrifices, and that individuals, even queens, may become little more than instruments in a broader design. As the ages passed, Jane's story found echo in the poems of romantic writers, in the dramas of Victorian stages, and in the hushed commentary of scholars. But it is only in our own time, with the distance of centuries and the objectivity of modern inquiry, that we begin to disentangle the myth from the woman. We see now that her legacy, though shaped by those who followed, remains a testament both to her quiet ambition and to the heartbreaking limits imposed by the brutal pragmatism of her era. And so, Jane Seymour endures in our collective memory as a figure of both reverence and regret. Her life, truncated by a ruthless calculus of power, stands as a somnolent reminder that even the most exalted women of history have often been compelled to pay the steepest of prices. In her story lies a gentle warning that we must look beyond the softly painted images and the soothing verse, to reckon with the very real human cost that underlies every chapter of dynastic glory. Jane Seymour's story is far more than a personal tragedy. It stands as a stark testament to the ruthless might of a patriarchal system. In the Tudor court, she was reduced to little more than an incubation machine, her humanity erased in pursuit of political ends. From the moment she wed Henry VIII, her body was valued not for its grace or its wisdom, but solely for its fertility. Every ounce of her identity as a woman, a partner, and a living soul was subordinated to the demands of succession. Viewed through the lens of our modern era, Jane's untimely death compels us to re-examine how women's lives have been valued or devalued throughout history. Even as a queen, she had no authority over choices that pertained to her body or her fate. The decisions that determined her very survival were made by men wielding power physicians who judged her expendable and a monarch who regarded her foremost as a means to an heir. Her sacrifice and suffering echo the silent agony endured by countless women of her time, all of whom were treated as assets, as reproductive vessels, and as pawns in the grand chess game of politics. In a world where medical knowledge was scant and often misguided, Jane's pain was compounded by ignorance. Postpartum care was a battleground of superstition and crude techniques, with little understanding of infection or blood loss. Many of the remedies applied to her were as likely to harm as to heal. Yet this medical inadequacy was only part of her plight. The true injury was the calculated indifference of a court that prized dynastic stability above all else. Jane's bleeding body lay neglected, because the survival of the realm's future king was deemed infinitely more precious than the life of his mother. Today, that grim calculus should resonate as a warning. The tale of Jane Seymour reminds us that the intersection of politics and medicine can become a crucible in which individual rights are consumed. When power is unchecked and driven by ambition, it can crush the most vulnerable under its weight, and in Jane's case, the vulnerable was not a distant subject, but the Queen herself, her body, her health. Her very existence laid bare to serve a singular purpose. The propaganda campaign that followed her death further obscured her real suffering. By sanctifying her image and smoothing away the scars of her agony, the Tudor court tried to erase the truth. Yet in doing so, it deprived her memory of the full dignity she deserved. We must resist such erasures today by insisting on historical honesty and by honouring the complete narratives of those who suffered under oppressive systems. Jane's life and her death teach us urgent lessons about human dignity. We must affirm that every person, regardless of rank or station, possesses an inherent worth that no political objective can override. We must champion medical practices that centre patient well-being over cold expedients, and we must remain vigilant against any attempt to reduce human beings to mere instruments of state or profit. In commemorating Jane Seymour, we ought not merely to celebrate a romanticized ideal of noble martyrdom. Rather, we should recognize her as a figure who embodied resilience and devotion in the face of a system that sought to render her invisible. Her quiet fortitude under unimaginable strain reveals a strength that transcends the myths of her era, and her ultimate abandonment illuminates the tragic costs exacted by unchecked authority. As we reflect on her legacy, let us carry forward a commitment to truth and compassion. Let Jane's story be heard in full, the pain as well as the poetry, the blood as well as the ballads. Only by remembering her as a real woman, with ambitions and sorrows, can we honour her memory rightly. In doing so, we affirm that power must always be tempered by empathy, and that the lives entrusted to our care are never mere tools for ambition. Thus, in the quiet echo of Jane Seymour's last breaths, we find a call to action to safeguard human dignity, to acknowledge the full measure of each life, and to challenge any force political, medical, or cultural that would claim the right to silence the living in service of grand designs. In her memory, we renew our vow to place compassion above conquest, and the sanctity of the individual above the ceaseless march of ambition. The account of Jane Seymour's death emerges through a tapestry of first-hand testimonies, entries penned by royal physicians, whispers recorded by ladies-in-waiting, and diplomatic dispatches sent to foreign powers. Within the velvet-bound pages of the court surgeon's ledger, one finds sober lines detailing her postpartum condition, the relentless trickle of blood, the pallor of her once radiant complexion, and the physician's weary notations on their fruitless attempts to staunch the flow. Meanwhile, in Amore Delicate Script, the journal of a devoted attendant captures Jane's final, desperate entreaty. "Let me be near my child," she begged, voice trembling, only to be met with the cold rationale that proximity might disturb the prince's fragile peace. Yet these intimate accounts, vivid with suffering and sorrow, were deemed inconvenient and quietly excised from the broader narrative beyond the walls of Hampton Court. The Spanish ambassador in London dispatched letters to Madrid that paint a subtly different picture. He wrote of the court's careful suppression of details, of how official proclamations lauded the king's solemn concern for his heir. While omitting mention of Jane's prolonged agony, his correspondence spoke in hushed tones of complications attributed to the birth. Steering clear of the more damning truths rumoured among the palace corridors, the ambassador's reports reveal a court ever mindful of its image, pruning away any leaf that might blemish the regal facade. In contrast, the pages of Jane's attendant bear ink smudged by tears. This loyal lady recorded how, late at night, she would cradle Jane's hand and murmur prayers against the oppressive silence of the chamber. She described the Queen's quiet sobs when forbidden to see the infant a sound so soft it might have been mistaken for the rustle of curtains. Such poignant fragments survived only because they were tucked away in private notebooks, shielded from official scrutiny. In the clash between these two sources, the gilded official record and the unvarnished personal testimony, we glimpse the monarchy's deliberate control of information, favouring the preservation of power over the honouring of truth. Century-later, modern historians have pored over these discordant manuscripts, cross-referencing them with contemporary medical knowledge by examining the described symptoms, excessive bleeding, signs consistent with retained placental fragments, and indications of uterine rupture. They have concluded that Jane Seymour's death resulted from severe postpartum hemorrhage. In the light of 21st century obstetric practice, such a condition is often survivable when met with prompt, skilled intervention, blood transfusions, surgically managed removal of retained tissue, and careful monitoring in a sterile environment. The fact that Jane lacked access to these measures underscores the tragic deficit of Renaissance medicine. Moreover, this retrospective analysis shines a harsh spotlight on the Tudor court's callous priorities. While Jane lay weakened by loss of blood, the physicians were dispatched more urgently to the birthing chamber of the prince, ensuring his thriving heartbeat took precedence over his mother's faltering pulse. This stark hierarchy, throne before throne-bearer, speaks to a worldview in which the continuance of dynastic power eclipsed the sanctity of individual life. Jane's body, once revered as a vessel of royal continuity, was ultimately deemed expendable when that singular function was fulfilled. Her story, thus, serves as a potent indictment of an era both deficient in medical wisdom and uncommonly indifferent to human suffering. The contrast between what might have been done in a modern hospital and what was actually done in her candlelit chamber is a chasm wide enough to swallow any veneer of chivalric romance. It reveals a system in which political expedience and courtly decorum were held above the well-being of a queen. Even today, Jane Seymour's plight resonates as a cautionary tale. It reminds us that behind every historical crown lies a human narrative, often marked by pain, fear, and abandonment. The manipulation of her death's narrative by those in power serves as an eternal reminder of the perils of information control. When truth is shaped to serve the ambitions of the few, the voices of the vulnerable, like Jane's final pleas, are too easily silenced. In acknowledging the full measure of Jane's ordeal, both in its vivid, personal detail and in its broader political context, we honour her not as a sanctified icon, but as a real woman who endured unspeakable hardships. Her legacy urges us to uphold the primacy of each individual life, to resist the rewriting of painful truths, and to remember that true power lies not in the ability to command history, but in the courage to confront it honestly. Jane Seymour's story lays bare the merciless nature of absolute power when dynastic ambition eclipses love and honour. Human beings become mere instruments. As queen, Jane possessed no agency over her own body or her own fate. Every aspect of her existence, from the moment she pledged her troth to the moment she drew her last breath, was dictated by the cold calculus of succession. She was at once sovereign and subject, exalted in title, yet deprived of any real authority over the events that would decide whether she lived or died. Today, as we reflect on Jane's ordeal, we see the urgent necessity of checks on power and the sanctity of individual dignity. The field of modern obstetrics, for instance, has evolved in no small part to counter the tragedies of the past. Policies ensuring comprehensive maternal care and the right of expectant mothers to make informed medical decisions stand as bulwarks against a recurrence of such neglect. Women now have the legal right to consent to or refuse procedures, to seek second opinions, and to receive care that prioritizes their well-being as much as the health of their children. These safeguards were born from lessons hard-learned reminders that every birthing person must be seen as a full human being, not merely a vessel for future generations. Furthermore, in a broader societal context, Jane Seymour's experience prompts critical reflection on the role of information itself. Transparent, accurate communication is essential to protecting human rights. Whereas propaganda can distort reality and conceal injustice, the Tudor court mastered the art of shaping perception, transforming Jane's suffering into a sanitized legend of martyrdom. By suppressing private testimonies and amplifying official paeans, the monarchy ensured that the darker truths of her final days remained hidden, replaced instead with an appealing facade of regal devotion. This manipulation underscores the potent power of narrative control, an influence that still resonates in every age. In our own time, we witness similar dynamics whenever institutions prioritize image over integrity. The spread of selective or misleading information can shield wrongdoing, shift blame, or reframe oppression as benevolence. Yet we also see the corrective effect of open discourse and journalistic inquiry, which can dismantle falsehoods and restore honor to those who have been wronged. By championing transparency, we not only honor the lived realities of individuals like Jane Seymour, but also fortify the foundations of a just society. In considering Jane's plight, we are reminded that rights and respect must never be conditional. The right to bodily autonomy, the right to compassionate care, and the right to truthful representation in history are not luxuries, but essentials of our shared humanity. To permit the concentration of unchecked authority is to risk repeating the darkest chapters of the past. Thus, we commit ourselves to vigilant oversight of power, robust advocacy for patient-centered medical practice, and unwavering defense of free, accurate information. Jane Seymour's legacy is, at its heart, a quiet call to conscience. It urges us to look beyond mythologized icons and to acknowledge the real people whose voices were silenced. It challenges us to build structures that value every life, that empower individuals rather than exploit them, and that seek truth, even when it disrupts cherished narratives. In doing so, we ensure that the suffering she endured was not in vain, but rather a somnolent whisper from history that stirs us to awaken our collective empathy and vigilance. May we remember Jane Seymour not only as a queen who died for a dynasty, but as a woman whose sacrifice demands our enduring commitment to a world in which no person is ever reduced to a means, and no suffering ever erased by the glare of propaganda. The image of Jane Seymour as a saintly figure who sacrificed herself for the crown has permeated literature, painting, and theatre for centuries. Court artists rendered her in soft watercolour tones, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, an idealized icon of the obedient wife and selfless mother. In countless portraits, she appears as a gentle soul draped in pale silks, her head bowed in serene submission, as if her very posture were an act of devotion to the throne. Elizabethan poets elevated her to mythic status, casting her as the pure white jasmine who blossomed amidst storms of ambition. Verses spoke of her quiet courage, her willingness to lay down her life so that England might endure. On the 17th century stage, playwrights dramatized her final days in lavish productions. Audiences wept as they watched the Queen's slow decline upon a golden bed, her flowing gowns stained with crimson, her lips whispering final prayers. The theatre's candlelight seemed to echo the soft glow of piety, inviting patrons to mourn not just a queen, but an emblem of the ultimate sacrifice. Yet behind the sumptuous costumes and the tearful lamentations lay truths long obscured by romantic reverie. Few imagined the agony that had racked her body, or the fear that must have gripped her heart. The stage directions omitted the grim details of blood-stained sheets and crude surgical interventions. Instead, they emphasized her gentle nature and the nobility of her suffering, transforming a brutal death into a tragic tableau of beauty and grace. Through the lens of art and poetry, posterity has often struggled to distinguish legend from reality. The pastel hues of watercolors and the lilting rhythms of verse instilled a collective memory of Jane that emphasized her softness and submission, masking the fierce determination that lay beneath. Her legacy became a harmonic chord of romantic sacrifice, soothing the conscience of those who saw in her the ideal of feminine purity. It is only in more recent times, with the rediscovery of original manuscripts and the application of modern medical analysis, that a truer portrait of Jane Seymour has begun to emerge. Scholars have pored over her attendance notebooks and the margin notes of court physicians to piece together the reality of her experience. They have seen in those faded lines the outlines of a woman who understood fully the political function she was to serve, who knew that her body was the vessel for the Tudor continuation, and who bore that knowledge with quiet steadiness, even as her flesh was torn by pain. Medical historians have examined her described symptoms: unabated hemorrhaging, signs of retained placenta, indications of possible uterine rupture, and have concluded that, with timely intervention and antiseptic technique, she might have survived. This realization reframes her sacrifice not as inevitable martyrdom, but as the tragic consequence of ignorance and indifference. The same hands that prepared the stage for her immortal image were the ones that allowed her to bleed unchecked. In reconstructing Jane's true likeness, we see a woman of both ambition and resilience. She navigated the treacherous currents of Henry VIII's court with a quiet intelligence, presenting a facade of meekness. While fully grasping the stakes of her role, she exercised agency where she could, choosing her comportment, masking her anxieties, and aligning herself with sympathetic courtiers. Yet all her strategic finesse counted for little when political expediency demanded her elimination, and when medical procedure proved woefully insufficient. Today, the art and literature that once cloaked Jane in ethereal beauty now serve as counterpoints to the harsher historical record. The tapestry of verse and paint reveals as much about societal longing for a virtuous heroine as it does about the erasure of uncomfortable truths. By comparing those romanticized portrayals with the stark evidence of her final days, we restore to Jane Seymour the fullness of her personhood, a woman of depth, courage, and tragic consequence. In this gentle, sleepy reflection on the Queen's life and death, we arrive at a more balanced legacy, one that honors her personal fortitude while lamenting the system that consumed her. We recognize the poetry and the drama for what they are: beautiful but incomplete, and we gratefully welcome the sober scholarship that fills the gaps. Jane Seymour, once painted as an angelic martyr, reappears now as a flesh-and-blood queen, ambitious, intelligent, and ultimately betrayed by the very power she served. And so, as the last candle flickers on her memory, we hold both images in our hearts: the tender queen of our collective imagination, and the real woman who bore the weight of dynastic ambition. In acknowledging both, we pay true homage to a life that was, for too long, confined to the gentle cadences of art, rather than the rough truths of history. After Jane's death, the Seymour family rose swiftly to prominence. Her brothers, Edward and Thomas, were granted lofty titles and appointed to key offices within the royal administration. Edward Seymour became Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector during young King Edward's minority, effectively ruling on his nephew's behalf. Thomas Seymour was named Baron Seymour of Sudeley and later married the Dowager Queen Catherine Parr, further cementing the family's influence. This meteoric ascent underscored the remarkable windfall the Seymours had gained through Jane's marriage to Henry VIII, a contest of alliances that transformed a once obscure gentry family into one of the most powerful houses in the realm. Yet Jane's passing also deepened the fault lines of Tudor politics. Her death became a rallying point for both opposing factions, The Catholic party seized upon it as a dark omen, claiming divine retribution for the king's break with Rome. Sermons in Latin-chanted cathedrals spoke of her fate as a chastisement for English sacrilege, cautioning that the realm paid a terrible price for its schism from the papacy. Meanwhile, Protestant reformers turned her into a symbol of righteous suffering, a champion of the new faith whose blood consecrated England's departure from papal authority. Pamphleteers lauded her as a steadfast heroine who had, in her death, affirmed the cause of Scripture over tradition. Thus, in the charged atmosphere of religious strife, Jane's name was invoked by both sides, each claiming her legacy to bolster its own ideology. This intensification of sectarian conflict shaped the political landscape for decades to come. Under Mary I, England briefly returned to Catholic observance, and Edward Seymour's Protestant sympathies made him a suspect, ultimately costing him his head. Under Elizabeth I, Protestantism was re-established, and Jane's memory was once more invoked as a martyr for the true faith. The ebb and flow of religious policy during their reigns illustrated the brittle tenuousness of alliances built upon dynastic marriages. Even though Jane had fulfilled the primary objective, producing a male heir, her death did little to stabilize the Tudor succession permanently. When Prince Edward ascended the throne at the tender age of 9, the realm was fraught with expectations. His regents, led initially by his uncle Edward Seymour, sought to continue the Reformation measures begun under Henry VIII. They repealed harsh anti-Protestant statutes and advanced the translation of the Bible into English, measures that reflected Jane's perceived role as a silent patron of reform. Yet Edward's health proved fragile. Tuberculosis claimed him before his 15th birthday, drawing his short reign to a premature end. The reverberations of his death sent shockwaves through the divided kingdom, demonstrating that even the most carefully engineered political marriages could not guarantee dynastic endurance. After Edward's passing, Mary I took the throne and sought to restore Catholicism, executing prominent Protestant leaders and persecuting dissenters. The realm shifted again, and then shifted once more under Elizabeth I, who navigated a middle path, establishing the Elizabethan religious settlement. Throughout these oscillations, the memory of Jane Seymour lingered in one era, a martyr of the Reformation. In another, a cautionary tale of divine wrath. Her legacy, so intimately bound to the fate of her son and her family, underscored the fragility of political alliances built on marriage alone. The Seymours, once elevated by Jane's union, found their fortunes tied inexorably to the shifting religious winds. Edward Seymour's protectorate ended abruptly in 1549 when he was deposed and executed for alleged treason. Thomas Seymour, too, fell from grace and was executed in 1548 amid accusations of scheming to control the young king. Their rapid rise and tragic fall highlighted that the gains of dynastic marriage were seldom secure, subject as they were to the shifting sands of political and religious fortune. In the end, Jane Seymour's parting gift, a male heir, proved insufficient to secure the Tudor line beyond her own son's brief reign. The succession crises that followed, the religious upheavals, and the fluctuating fortunes of the Seymour family all testified to the limits of matrimonial politics. Though a queen's body had borne a prince, it could not shield him from disease, nor preserve him from the machinations of regents and rivals. Jane's story, therefore, stands as a poignant reminder of how the fates of individuals are woven into the grand tapestry of power. Her sacrifice illuminated both the heights and the perils of political marriages under absolute monarchy. She fulfilled the singular duty demanded of her, producing a king, yet the ripples of her labours revealed how little such a duty could insulate a dynasty from the tides of history. In the quiet hush of her memory, we hear the echo of all those who, like Jane, became entangled in forces larger than themselves, their lives and legacies shaped by ambition, faith, and the relentless pursuit of influence. The story of Jane Seymour, with all its pain and sacrifice, is not merely a personal tragedy or a footnote in Tudor history. but carries profound values and messages for us today. First, it is a powerful reminder of the immutable nature of power when dynastic ambition is placed above all else. Even human lives can become expendable. Jane, a queen. A mother was reduced to a reproductive machine under the absolute authority of the regime, stripped of any right to decide over her own body and fate. Messages of family, love, or personal dignity proved powerless to shield her from the cold calculus of the throne. Second, her story warns us about the harms of propaganda and information control. The image of Jane, as a saintly figure who sacrificed herself for the crown, was so meticulously crafted that it obscured the bloody truth of her 12 days of suffering. Only when original documents, a lady-in-waiting's diary, and modern medical analyses were rediscovered did her true portrait emerge. This demonstrates that, in any era, when information is distorted, even the faintest voices like her plea, "Let me be near. My child," can be drowned out by dazzling political proclamations. Third, Jane Seymour's case illuminates lessons about maternal health care and women's autonomy. Today, we clearly recognize the importance of comprehensive care, informed consent, and patient rights in obstetrics. From allowing mothers to refuse or accept any procedure, to ensuring adequate emergency resources and postnatal support, these safeguards aim to correct the errors of the past. Jane paid the ultimate price simply because her life was not valued as highly as that of Prince Edward. Finally, this story calls us to honor human dignity and to speak up for the vulnerable. In retrospect, we see not just a symbol of sacrifice, but a strong, intelligent, and ambitious woman who endured profound loneliness within gilded walls. Let Jane Seymour be more than a sleepy image in history. Let her life and death remind us always to place human dignity and the value of each person above any pursuit of power.